Your series is made possible by our generous sponsor, Christine Meyer, and is presented in partnership with the Wellesley Free Library. Tonight's program is also made possible by the Friends of the Wellesley Free Library. We have a terrific speaker. Paul Fisher is an acclaimed biographer and cultural historian whose books bring to life American literary and artistic expatriates of the Belle Epoque period. His work has been reviewed in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Spectator, and the Times Literary Supplement, and many other publications. His most recent book, The Grand Affair, John Singer Sargent and His World, was named a New Yorker and Times Literary Supplement Book of the Year in 2022. Was nominated for the Biographers International Organization Plutarch Prize in 2023. He has taught at Yale, Wesleyan, Boston University, and Harvard, and is currently professor and chair of American Studies at Wellesley College. We please welcome Professor Paul Fisher.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me with the mic? Let's start with that. Okay. Okay, is that better? Can you hear better? I'll try to lean into it. Maybe move it this way. Okay, we want to hear me really clearly. You've already had ordeals. I figured I'd be speaking to about 3 people, so it's great to see all of you here. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the Wellesley Historical Society and the Wellesley Free Library for organizing this. And the fact that there's this big a group is very New England. And for those of you who are into the history of New England, I have inserted some interesting stuff about John Singer Sargent's relation to Boston and to New England in this whole thing. If I'm back from the mic, can you still hear me? Okay, because I want to make sure, because I have to see what slides I'm showing to make sure I know what I'm doing. I always like to get to know my audience a little bit, so I'm going to ask you some questions. First question, how many of you were art history majors? A couple of people. How many of you took an art history course at some point in your career? Quite a few people. And my first confession is that I'm not an art historian. I'm a cultural historian, which means that I'm interested in the social underpinnings of art. I have been trained rigorously by art historians, but I alarm art historians when I come into a room because I think of different things than some of them do. Next question is, how many of you are fans of Sargent? I figured there'd be lots of that. I have spoken to lots of rooms full of Sargent fans, and one of the things that I feel about loving Sargent is I've loved Sargent for years and have been trying to figure out why I love him so much, and everybody's answer is going to be different. And I promise not to step on your answer, whatever it may be, because I think it's pretty individual. But there is something for me, something enigmatic, hence the title of this lecture, The Enigma of John Singer Sargent. And that's one of the things that I tried to figure out by writing a biography. And again, my answers might be a little bit different from yours, but we're going to investigate some of these mysteries. And to start with the cover of my book, one of the first things that people say is, couldn't you find an in-focus picture of John Singer Sargent? And the truth is that the Gardner Museum does have those. I should get the pointer in my hand because this is one of the things about the sense of power. I love the sense of power that I can have with this. Okay. I'm a college professor. I am never powerful anywhere at all. So this is good for me. And I'm okay. Just trying to, okay. Anyway, but what we were trying to suggest by this cover is how hard to pin down Sargent is, how complicated he is. And one of the ways he's complicated is vis-a-vis men and women. And that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. And I promise you I will get to New England too, and to Boston. But I'm going to start with this image, Sargent's most famous woman. And all of you know that that is Madam X, who lives in New York now and has her own life. One of the hardest things I have explaining to my students is why this is such a scandal in 1884 when it comes around. And when I query them, I get all kinds of answers like, well, there's a bit of décolletage and so forth. And they are a little bit, it's all about skin exposure. But in fact, what's scandalous about this is much more complicated. And part of it is knowing the background. This woman, as many of you may know, is Emily Gautreaux. And she's a Louisiana-born Paris socialite. So she's an American who's living in Paris. And she's also a really notorious adulterer. She's married to a French a banker, but she gets around town and she's in the illustrated papers all the time. And one of the reasons she's a scandal is because of her reputation. She's a known person in Paris, and the fact that Sargent is showing her as proud and undimmed is one of the things that's scandalous about this. And look at that pose, that attitude, and not to mention the skin color, which is sometimes described as moon glow pale, or very, I mean, my kids don't see the skin color as significant as it is. It's decadent. She looks like a corpse. I mean, she looks like a pretty corpse. This is the nature of decadence. Welcome to the wonderful world of decadence. Well, and the other part of it too is that in the original version, as many of you may know, the strap was down. And when the strap is down, it gives a whole new meaning to this picture. She's kind of climbing out of her dress. And that was one of the things that was, again, scandalous at the time. So it was very interesting to me when I started to work on Sargent about 1 million years ago, that Sargent made his reputation through women, all kinds of different women that he painted. Madame X being one example, but it's not the only example. Now, here's Sargent in his Paris studio about the time he painted Madame X, and you'll notice, in fact, that he has his back to Madame X because he's so traumatized by how scandalous it was. He wanted to get people's attention, but he didn't want to create quite as much of a scandal as he, in fact, did. He's also looking at a smaller painting that's of his sister Violet that I'll show you in a minute. And he's between two different kinds of women. And the way that he calibrates women and creates women, for me, of course, I teach at Wellesley, I need to say this, is like one of the most important things about him and his career. Now, this is especially important if you think about what a portrait is. He's mainly a portraitist. He does other things too. Many of you may know his absolutely fabulous watercolors. But you know, what a portrait is a negotiation among a painter, a sitter, a patron, and an audience. So that the women that he's painting, I think, are sort of co-creators of these fantastic images that he's making. So what happens is that the portraits encode Sargent's relation to women sitters, models, and patrons. And you would think that that would be really different in different cases. For example, when he's painting Isabella Stewart Gardner, you would think, well, of course she's interacting because she's paying him. And if you know anything about the story of this painting, there were 9 versions of it. This is the 9th version. And Isabella Stewart Gardner was not easy to please, and was not a shy flower, shall we say. You would think it would be different with a subject like Rosina Ferrara, a 17-year-old Capri peasant that Sargent met in Italy, but in fact, not so much. She was pretty dynamic too and had a lot to say about how she was painted and how Sargent understood her. And in fact, she later married an American artist called Randolph Barse and ended up moving to Westchester County, where she ruled the roost. So again, what we're talking about is the dynamism of women at this period. And that's one of the things that Sargent is attaching himself to. He likes dynamic women. He likes smart, interesting, sexy, rule-breaking women, and that's one of the things that makes this painting so engaging. So one of the things that we're talking about with Sargent's women is gendered painter-model relations. And this is kind of how they are at the turn of the 20th century and Sargent's sort of heyday, which is illustrated by our own American painter, Edward Hopper, in a painting from right at the turn of the century. Now, again, people say to me, couldn't you find a color slide of this painting? But in fact, Hopper painted it in black and white because he's suggesting that this dynamic is so basic to the way that art works in his world that it's like a black and white photograph. It's almost documentary. And what it shows you is a male artist looking at a female object. In this case, a nude that the artist is painting. And some of this stuff comes from there's a lot about Paris in my book, and I'm going to talk about Paris in tension with Boston a little bit later in the talk. But one of the things that's happening in Paris is this sense that there's a kind of almost a sort of sexual connection between the painter and the model, and that it's sort of outre, but it's something, in other words, tapping into sex somehow. But in fact, there's something a lot more going on when we think of these painter-model relations. Now, one of the things about Sargent is his version of this, though there's the whole painter model, what we're talking about is, in academic circles, it gets called the gaze, G-A-Z-E, meaning the male gaze on women. But in fact, Sargent's way of looking at women is really different from his contemporaries. It's strikingly different, and I'm giving you some examples here. If we look at the breakfast table versus Sargent's friend Frank Millet's The Cozy Corner from the same year, 1884, also the year of Madame X, we see that they're really different. And when I have my students, you may or may not be able to see very well from where you're sitting, but when I have my students sort of look at these, they're really struck by how the one is very sentimental, very stylized. That, by the way, these are both images of women reading books, which is a very powerful thing about how women are changing at the turn of the century because they're becoming educated at Wellesley and other such places. And when was the last time you read a book like that? Very sort of stylized. My students describe this as cottagecore, as a very sort of stylized woman, versus Sargent's version, which is his sister Violet, who was like 14 years old and who was a tough nut to crack, and who was reading, the way that interesting people read books. She's leaning over the table, she's leaning on her elbow, she's eating an apple. She's in this dazzling modern Paris room. So she's not some historical figure. She's a contemporary woman interacting with life. And I think Sargent's painting is about 12 times as good as Millet's painting as a sort of artistic production, but it's also more interesting sort of socially. Here's a close-up of Frank. By the way, this is Frank Millet's wife, Lily Millet. And again, the kind of sentimentalized version that Frank Millet sort of sees versus Sargent's portrait of Lily Millet, which I just love that portrait. And I think it's in the present show. I believe it's in the present show. What I forgot to ask you before is how many of you have gone to the MFA to see the present show? That's great. And if you haven't, it's leaving yesterday or left yesterday, but it's going next to the Tate Britain. So there's an excuse to go to London. There you go. But back to this, Mrs. Frank Millet, we have a very beautiful woman leaning forward, looking straight at you, and again, wearing very contemporary clothing. She's pretty, but she looks like she has thoughts and ideas, which in fact Lily Millet did. She became a decorator in New York later in her life, and she was much more dynamic than she looks in her husband's version of her. Here's another pairing. We have Sargent's Madame Ramon Subercaseaux, who is the wife of a Chilean diplomat in Paris, who Sargent bonded with. They were both musicians, and they talked a lot about music in Latin America. And what we can see going on here is this very beautiful woman who's surrounded by luxury objects is nevertheless a pretty interesting woman because her hands are dragging off the piano keys as if she's just been playing. So she's not just a sort of object. She's somebody who can sort of have some subjective experiences. She can play the piano. She can be a real person. Now, Whistler's version from a couple decades before, it's one of his white girl paintings. It's a very beautiful painting, but it's full of luxury objects. And guess what? The woman's another luxury object. She's leaning on the mantelpiece. She's kind of gazing off into the air. And by the way, the person being depicted is Joanna Heffernan, who is Whistler's mistress and his business manager. Does this say business manager to you? And again, so she's this very dynamic person who's rendered kind of floral and kind of ineffectual. And Whistler, who's a very tough cookie, and a very interesting painter, is not capturing the kind of stuff in these images of women that Sargent is. Now, here's Isabella Stewart Gardner that we mentioned before. And so one of the questions is, is Sargent lending power to women, or are these empowered women somehow impacting Sargent? And I think it's kind of both things. Sargent was intrigued by the new things that women were doing at the turn of the century. They were getting educations, they were traveling independently, they were getting divorced. They were doing other kinds of things that were sort of interesting. And Sargent kind of was almost envious of how much energy these kinds of people had. He was also interested in different sort of aspects of women, including some transgressive exoticism. He loved to paint, for example, Spanish dancers. The opera Carmen was really very big all during Sargent's career. And along similar lines, we have Sargent's El Jaleo, which is in the Gardner Museum, one of my very favorite paintings, which really just sort of encompasses a woman with a lot of sort of dynamism and sexual energy. And this painting I could have written a whole book about. You know, one of the problems I had is that you know, I wasn't going to write about too much about this, that, and the other. I wasn't going to even write about Madame X, and I got like 2 or 3 chapters out of it. But anyway, this is a fascinating painting because of all that's going on here, and there's really a lot going on. So when Sargent is thinking about dynamic women, here's another sort of example. This is Carmencita, who was a popular dancer in Paris, and then she came to New York, where she was toast of the town. Sargent seemed to be pretty infatuated with her, and she was painted by other American painters in New York at the time, including William Merritt Chase. This is around 1890. And by the way, this is also in the current show, and her actual dress is there, which you can compare to this. And by the way, Sargent owned this dress. This wasn't Carmencita's dress. This was Sargent's dress that he put Carmencita in. And I'm going to actually show you Carmencita because I can. And if you've been to the exhibit, you've probably seen this too. And I see if I can make this happen. Please. Okay, I think it's going to happen. There we go. That's actual footage of Carmencita from Edison's studio in 1894, about 4 years after Sargent painted her. And again, when I ask my students, what's so scandalous about that? They say, well, she's showing some ankle, which is kind of a big deal for the 1890s. But for me, it's more about her freedom of movement. What Sargent is interested in is her sort of power and freedom of movement. And you know, it's a great clip. And by the way, this is the first woman ever filmed in the United States. And so, you know, somebody else besides Sargent thought this was pretty interesting. And just the way that this woman moved was interesting. And so, let's see, I have more Carmencita. I don't think, no, I have 2 Carmencitas there. Okay. But one of the things that you'll see here is, I asked my students, well, which image looks more like the real Carmencita, at least as we can see it in the film? And of course, it's William Merritt Chase's image, who does look literally more like Carmencita. But on the other hand, Sargent has created a Carmencita that captures some of her chutzpah and energy. She's standing up very erect. She's got a hand on her hip. The hand on hip thing is going to be very important as a gesture. She's got a mask-like face. It's almost like a Japanese kabuki player. And what he's given her is a lot of magnetism and power. And he's really tried to make a very formidable person. By the way, she had a lot of chutzpah. She was a French professor's daughter. She wasn't a Spanish Roma. But she kind of had the boldness to sort of make a career for herself doing this kind of thing. And that's one of the things that Sargent admired about her, that she was absolutely fearless. And that's what Sargent tried to illustrate in his quite wonderful painting, this again in the current show. Now, when Sargent brought Carmencita to Boston, disaster occurred. Bostonians did not take to Carmencita other than Mrs. Gardner. So, you know, in fact, there are funny accounts about how bored, or how disapproving the Bostonians were of everything about Carmencita. And Sargent loved every moment of it because he loved transgressive women that would get the go to various people. And this again is about Sargent's sort of tension as an American painter with certain kinds of American things and his adopting certain other things. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a minute. Now, to turn to men for a moment, here's John Singer Sargent's Theodore Roosevelt. from the turn of the century. And one of the things that you see here is a different kind of production. It's actually it's a great painting. And Sargent had a terrible time doing this. He came to the White House. I think he even stayed in the White House for a while. Roosevelt had recently remodeled the White House and added the West Wing, and it was on one of the new staircases that Sargent found a place to paint him, and they wandered all over the White House in order to do this. But Sargent did not have a good time with Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, he later said that he felt like a rabbit in the presence of a boa constrictor. That's because Theodore Roosevelt was the kind of sort of no-nonsense, rough rider, man's man that Sargent was not used to encountering. The kind of man that he was more used to encountering was like Dr. Posey at home, which is also in the current show. And if you have the audio guide, you hear me talking about this, and the fact that they gave me this to talk about overjoyed me. I was dancing around for 3 days just because it was so exciting to talk about this painting, because again, it's a very transgressive, interesting view of what a man is. It's a boudoir portrait, because there he is in his red dressing gown in a red sort of space with all kinds of sensual and suggestive sort of moments. This guy's a pretty interesting personality. And one of the mutual friends of Sargent and him said about him, "I've never met a man of such seductiveness, of which he gave me incomparable proofs." Now, if you see on the left, that's what the guy actually wore around Paris. That's what he looked like when he went to parties. But Sargent wanted to paint him in a much more sort of provocative and sort of intimate way, and in a way that, again, was not in keeping with the way that the late 19th century understood the roles of men and women. And Sargent wasn't afraid to sort of do this in people's faces. In fact, he was smart enough not to show this portrait in Paris, because it probably would have caused an uproar. He showed it in London and he showed it in Belgium. And I think I have a couple quotes from what people said. In Belgium, they said, "It's a complete a sample of bad taste dear to certain youths of the French school." And Sargent's wonderful friend Vernon Lee said about this painting that it had an insolent kind of magnificence. And by the way, Sargent loves insolence. He's a Bostonian. He's a very reserved kind of Bostonian, quiet guy. This is back to the Enigma, who loves insolence. And so he's kind of a combination of Paris and Boston that's really unstable, shall we say. It's a funny combination. Okay, so when Sargent represents himself, here are a couple of self-portraits. One from the 1880s, about the time of Madame X, and one from a little later. Now, Sargent did not have the instincts of a self-portraitist. He gives very little away in either portrait. I like the 1880s one better personally, because there's a little bit more sensitivity. There's a little bit more sort of personality to it. The 1906 portrait was painted for a gallery of honor at the Uffizi. It's still at the Uffizi. And it's a beautiful painting, but people have said about this painting that Sargent looks like a banker, and a banker who is not going to give you the loan. So this again is the tension in Sargent between being this very reserved, buttoned-up guy with some New England antecedents and being somebody who really kind of let loose in Paris and who has these kind of, what I call it in my book is warring instincts. He's got, warring instincts, and these kind of show up a little bit in these portraits, but he's again masking something. One of the things that I talk a lot about is the difference between Sargent's private and his public work. There's a lot of his public work, which is pretty well known now, and a lot of the show is the public work, tells one story, and the private work tells another story. And there are many other stories, but one of the things that we learn from some of the private pieces, as well as a few of the public ones, is that Sargent has a very unconventional gaze. And here's Sargent's friend from Paris, again about the time of Madame X, called Albert de Belroche, who is an Anglo-Belgian painter that Sargent took a lot of time with. And then the other person I'm giving you here is Thomas McKellar, I will talk about a little bit later, who's a black model Sargent uses in Boston. And they have a lot more to say about Thomas McKellar. So, and both of these people give us a different side of Sargent that tell us some more complicated things about him. So one of the things that we can actually find out, and I hope you can see with the resolution on these, is that in fact, something complicated is going on with Madame X. And what's complicated, this was discovered by an art historian called Dorothy Moss in the year 2000. She dug up this sketch from the Yale Art Gallery, which is the head of a young man in profile, which is Albert de Belleroche, the guy that I showed you, who is a friend of Sargent's in his studio, and a different image of Madame X drinking a toast. It's the same pose. There's a man and a woman who are there's some gender bending going on. There's a man and a woman who are pretty close here. And one of the things to know about Madame X is at the same time Sargent is painting Madame X, he's painting Albert de Belleroche. And there's in fact a complicated thing going on. There are more reasons why that painting is scandalous than people were actually aware at the time. Here's another image of Albert de Belleroche from the same period. And you'll notice there's a little thread down the middle because it was torn in half. And then it was put back together. And we actually have the story of when that happened. It was the storminess and turmoil of studio life. And so there's a lot of emotional stuff going on with these images, both men and women, but images of men and women. Now, Sargent also expresses a lot of this stuff about men and women through what you might call a gestural language. And one of the gestures I talk a lot about in the book is the arm akimbo. And it has lots of different meanings. You can see this in a painting, in a portrait of Leon Delafosse, who's a friend of Proust's, and W. Graham Robertson, who's a friend of Oscar Wilde's. And here is Oscar Wilde. These are Saroni photographs of Oscar Wilde, famous for the hands on the hips. It was originally an aristocratic sort of gesture. Sargent loved it in the paintings of Velázquez, which were of aristocrats. So it's got an aristocratic history, but in the 1890s, it's also coded as queer. It's Oscar Wilde's sort of signature gesture, and it happens in a lot of Sargent paintings. Now, let's go back to Thomas McKellar for a second, because I wanted to talk a little bit more about him. I was lucky enough to participate in another show that happened in Boston in the year 2020. By the way, it opened in, I think it was January or February 2020. We all have that calendar engraved in our minds because we know that the pandemic came along, and this show had to close, and then it opened later on. So the timing was not great for that. But this was the first exhibit ever to treat Sargent's black model, Thomas McKellar, and his relation to the painter. And by the way, this catalog is just fantastic. Boston's Apollo, though it's hard to get if you try to get it on Amazon. You know, it costs a tremendous amount because they're pretty rare. For some reason, Yale University Press didn't print enough. But anyway, what's going on here is really complicated, and it has to do with both race and gender. And this particular story tells us a lot. It's going to start telling us a little bit about Boston too, but tells us a lot about sort of how Sargent functions. This is the Vendôme Hotel, which many of you may know as the Vendôme. It's still there in Commonwealth Avenue. And this is where Sargent met McKellar. And this is not an image of McKellar, obviously, but it's the kind of bellboys or elevator operator uniform that he would have worn at the time. And he somehow persuaded him to model for him, to do nude modeling for him. This, by the way, is a really complicated feature of the 19th century, this nude modeling thing. And historically, art historians have not been that interested in models. My book is at least 30% models, because I think the models are very interesting, and they're the ones that Sargent chooses are very interesting. And this guy, I should give you an actual picture of him, and I will in a second, is pretty interesting. And what Sargent used him for was what many of us know extremely well, which is the rotunda of the new Museum of Fine Arts. It was new at the time in the early 20th century. And when you walk up from the entrance and you go up into the rotunda, you see these decorations in the ceiling. And these kind of mythological white figures, many of which are based on a black model. So again, something really complicated is going on here. Here's a more specific example. The sketches don't match. There's a different sketch of McKellar than the one that becomes part of Atlas and the Hesperides. But the reason I'm showing you Atlas and the Hesperides is because one of the few quotes we have from Thomas McKellar, I wrote the first ever biography of Thomas McKellar. Nobody had cared before and nobody was interested. And I had to dig around for literally 5 years to find enough stuff to write about. But one of his sayings to a later art historian interviewer was, Atlas with the world on his shoulders, that was my body. So what he's saying, well, he's saying a lot of things about the way that Black people are burdened in this country, but he's also saying that in a way, Sargent used his body to create this sort of ethereal mythological figure. And one of the things that we explored a lot in this exhibition is what that means. On the one hand, Sargent is much more interested in sort of Black figures than many portraitists of his time. On the other hand, he kind of erases the Blackness of the figure and turns them into mythological figures. So complicated things are going on. One of the most complicated versions of this, I'm going to show you in a second, is that as another model said, Sargent sometimes executed nude figures which had no special purpose for the museum, but were instead an inspirational diversion. One example of this is this painting, which is in the MFA, which has been in the MFA since 1986, and which has always been really controversial. And because of the complexity of the kind of figure that it shows. This is Thomas McKellar. And it's a very beautiful painting, but a very complicated one. My colleague, Nikki Green at Wellesley, has written some stuff about this. I've written some stuff about this. And much ink has been spilled, but let me just tell you what I sort of think about this. Sargent's emotive theatrical vision of this nude model remained provocative. The painting suggested both oppression and liberation, both deep humanity and voyeuristic objectification. So very complicated things emerged from Sargent's studio because of this. Now, one of the things that I really think is true about Sargent is that sex and gender are really important for his lasting achievements. And again, this has a lot to do with his public and private life. And this brings us back to the exhibition fashioned by Sargent, which I think is, for those of you who saw it, I would love to have just, if we have the opportunity to hear what you thought of it. I would have gone just to see all those Sargent paintings in one place. It's just amazing. Another thing that I found amazing, having studied them for years in sort of digital versions, is that some of them are gigantic, literally larger than life. And when you see a row of those, you get this impression that is really sort of fantastic and really high impact. And the clothes are gorgeous. I also like, as a cultural historian, I also like clothes because they connect us to the history even more. And so to see the actual dress or outfit next to the painting is something that we'll never have a chance to again. I hope I'm not making anyone feel regrets about not having made it over there if you didn't. But it's a really amazing thing. The curator, Erica Hirschler, whom I've worked with for years, did an amazing job of pulling these things together and bringing them together. So there's your excuse to go to London if you missed it, because it's so great. The piece that I contributed to the catalog and the room that was named after me was the Sporting with Gender room, where I talk about Sargent's complicated relation to depicting men and women. And it was a very volatile time. People sometimes describe that era as a gender crisis. We have our own version of gender crises going on here and now, but it certainly was true for the late 19th century. And what that means is that women were doing all kinds of new things. Women were becoming much more dynamic, and men were also considered sort of endangered. The men who were working in offices in cities, where was their masculinity? They were suffering from things like neurasthenia, which we would now describe as something like depression. So Sargent taps into all of that and makes very edgy, provocative, interesting images that make us think more about who people are and how they express themselves. So Again, I think sex and gender inform a lot of Sargent's most lasting achievements, and Madame X is a good example of that. And of course, here's again Dr. Posey at home, which I think is an absolutely splendid painting that you know you could have seen in Boston recently, and you can now see in London. Usually, you have to go to Los Angeles to see this painting, which is a long way. I don't know about you. I don't wander through Los Angeles that often. So to underline the same point in a different way, I want to talk about Sargent's background in Massachusetts. And in a different talk, and I wanted to make sure I did this for the group of you that are like from the Wellesley Historical Society, because I wanted to talk a little bit about local history. And you may, and one of the questions I really start with, is Sargent a Boston painter or a Paris painter? I can't tell you the number of times that people have said to me, well, isn't Sargent kind of a from Massachusetts or a Boston painter? I said, no, he was born in Florence. His mother was from Philadelphia, but his father was from Massachusetts, from Gloucester. And I don't know if any of you have been to the Sargent House Museum in Gloucester. It's a fantastic place that Sargent picked the wallpaper out for. Some of his images used to be there. A lot of them have moved to the Cape Ann Museum. But Sargent himself has kind of flinty Massachusetts ancestry. And here's one of his very interesting ancestors. This is Judith Sargent Murray, whose house you just saw a minute ago. Any of you heard of Judith Sargent Murray before? This is a wonderful painting by John Singleton Copley of when she was about 17 during her first marriage. And I think it's an absolutely beautiful painting. But she was a firebrand. And in 1890, she wrote a tract called On the Equality of the Sexes. This is 2 years earlier than Mary Wollstonecraft, talking about sort of gender equality. So again, this is somebody who was in Sargent's family, so Sargent was well equipped to have this kind of experience. Now, another person I like to talk about is Sargent's mother. In fact, one of the many reasons I wrote this biography is because I wanted to rescue Sargent's mother from the last main biography from the 1980s, which described her as self-indulgent and spoiled and how she ruined the Sargent family. I don't think any of this is true. She's the reason why Sargent grew up in Europe and in fact never visited the United States until he was 20 years old, and grew up speaking fluent French and Italian. And she had a tourist sensibility. She loved travel. She traveled for her health, but she really traveled because she loved the dynamism of it. And women's travel, by the way, is something huge that's happening in Sargent's time. And Mary Sargent is a great exemplar of this. So Sargent had an itinerant childhood. He grew up in Italy and France and other kinds of, he in fact never lived in an English-speaking country until he was in his 30s. And everybody was impressed by how beautifully Sargent spoke French and Italian. And when he was growing up, these are the places. I'm not even going to read this out because it would take us too much time, but these are some of the places where he sort of lived. You name it, he lived there. And in fact, sometimes when I vacation in Europe, I try to find a place Sargent didn't go, and it's hard. It's sort of hard to find that. But not only did they live in all these places, but everywhere they went, because of Mrs. Sargent, they went out and painted and drew everything that they saw. She herself was an aspiring painter. And I think a lot of the stuff that's lyrical and beautiful about Sargent's paintings comes from that. At the same time, Sargent really identified as an American, and partly because he grew up, though, in these European cities, in American communities in these European cities. Henry James, for example, hated to go to Rome because he didn't want to get involved with, quote, Cambridge bun fights, that is, tea parties thrown by Cambridge people who were living in London, or excuse me, living in Rome. And so this again is the paradox of Sargent, that he's both somebody who considers himself very American, who spoke with a kind of Bostonian accent, and yet had hardly ever seen Boston before he was a certain age. He also painted a lot of really pretty amazing Bostonians. Here's one example. This is Mrs. Edward Darley Boyd, Mary Louisa Cushing, who is a local from Boston. And by the way, speaking of the clothing here, I love the polka dot skirt. And her effervescence and her energy, again, something that Sargent loved tapping into. And of course, she's the mother of, guess who? the four little girls in this wonderful painting, which again, I wasn't going to write a lot about because my friend and colleague Erica Hirschler had written a really wonderful book called Sargent's Daughters, which if you haven't read it, I really recommend. What I think is great about this is that this complicated painting, which people compare to Velázquez's Las Meninas, is really one of the masterworks of the world, and it lives locally. You can go see it locally, and these are Massachusetts people. So this is kind of what Boston looked like at the time that Sargent first started visiting it in the late 1880s. And this is a wonderful version by Child Hassam, Boston Common at Twilight, that also lives in the MFA, if you've seen this before. And what I like is the tension between Paris and Boston that's in all of these things, because in fact, Hassam is a would-be impressionist who also trained in Paris. So this may look like Boston, and looks like Boston Common on a day similar today when there's kind of cruddy weather. But what we're actually seeing is the impressionist love of depicting public transportation. This was one of the big subjects of the Impressionists. They loved it, and people didn't think it was worth representing before they came along, and Child Hassam is seeing that for Boston. So again, we have Sargent in his Paris studio, this famous image of him, and we think of him as somewhat Parisian, and again, here's the question, is he a Paris or a Boston painter? And the truth is that it's so complicated to say, because Back Bay itself is Paris. Back Bay is Beaux-Arts. It's done in a Beaux-Arts style that comes from, guess what, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And that's why there's so much French stuff in Back Bay. And the kind of clash between Parisian cosmopolitanism and old New England stiffness creates a very interesting set of paradoxes in Boston. We're going back to some of those images. So there's plenty more to say about Sargent as a Boston or a Paris painter, and about his Boston antecedents. He ended up spending a lot of time in Boston pretty instinctively, but we've kind of run out of time for the main talk, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. Yes.
Question, but there wasn't TV and stuff, so he didn't know, or movies, he didn't know these people from images. How did he recruit these models? For example, how did he hook up with Isabella Stewart Gardner?
Those for me are, I'm so glad you asked that question, because those are some of the most interesting stories, because that's what I mean. The models aren't just random people who are just bodies. They're people that Sargent was interested in and cultivated, or who found him. And in the case of Isabella Stewart Gardner, Gardner tracked him down. Through Henry James. And in fact, Sargent was very nervous about meeting Gardner, as well he should have been. She was a powerhouse, and they had a great sort of professional relationship. One of the things that I really love is there's this weird book from the 1950s called the Lady and the Painter, or something like that, by this Bostonian who became a Hungarian countess. And it's all about this real affair between Sargent and Isabella Stewart Gardner. And it's fun reading. I added years to my life reading this book. But on the other hand, it's so totally not what their relationship was about. What their relationship was about is very professional. I mean, professional in the way that Isabella Stewart Gardner did it. She needed admiration from anything male that came within her orbit. And so that there was some admiration going on there. But both of them really were interested in bringing certain kinds of painting and art to the United States. Gardner created that whole amazing museum, and Sargent was one of the painters that she really recruited. So that's one of the interesting stories, and it really shapes the way that Sargent is going to paint. Isabella Stewart Gardner, in fact, wanted a painting that was as scandalous as Madame X, and she got it. Because that painting I showed you could not be shown during her her husband's lifetime, because Isabella Stewart Gardner was also a famous adulterer, and that did not go over well in Boston at all. The fact that there's a very proud image of her looking, kind of sassy, did not go over well. And there was also kind of idolatry in the image. And I love what her long-suffering husband, Jack Gardner, said about that painting. One of my favorite quotes, fun for an audience that's been sitting here for a while. "It looks like hell, but it looks like you." Yeah, so yeah, that whole relationship is really interesting. I mean, both between Sargent and Gardner, and her husband, very interesting. Yes.
Kind of explain to us the trail of Madam X shown on the television commercial, because she has the strap down and then it shows the strap moving up. And I saw something that left me scratching my head and wondering.
What is that all about? Exactly. What is that all about? And in fact, Sargent did, the reason that we only have the one photograph of it down is because Sargent was so traumatized by the whole experience that he repainted it up. And part of that was Madam X and her mother insisted on that because it was such a scandal and so damaging to them socially. I actually think the real scandal of it is even more complicated than the strap, but that's Deborah Davis's wonderful book, Strapless, which is fun to read too. Well, he was doing different paintings all the time, but because he did so many provocative things, he was often getting the wrong side of things. And of course, he's a portrait painter. He doesn't want to alienate people who are going to get portraits. And Henry James was moving him to London at this point. And he was, some mutual friends said, "You got to be careful how you paint people. If you paint them too nervous, they will not come sit for you." And so he again was anxious about trying to make some money from this because he was trying to support his mother and sisters at this point. And portrait painting was a kind of bread and butter thing. So on the one hand, he wanted a certain amount of provocation to sell paintings and to get his reputation, because all this was happening when Sargent was in his 20s. He was really young, and he cultivated scandal to make a reputation for himself, especially the scandalous women. But with Madame X, he overshot. And he was so traumatized, he was traumatized literally for years. I try not to make that part of the book too long because he was really traumatized. There was another couple of hands up. Yes.
Sargent was known to occasionally visit with Edmund Tarbell and Frank Benson when he was in town. And I think they had some clashes of personalities. Any interesting stories about how he interfaced with the two stalwarts of the Bay School?
Very interesting stuff. I mean, Sargent loved fellow painters. He hung out and he was pretty compatible with most of them, even when their styles were different. And one of the things that he loved about being in Boston is that he was able to connect with all kinds of interesting painters. Another local painter he dealt with, whose name is going to escape me for a second, Dennis Bunker, who was another sort of. I've actually talked to the Tavern Club, and there's a wonderful image of Dennis Bunker in the Tavern Club. But you're mentioning some names there of interesting painters that Sargent was dealing with. One of the premises of my book is that it's really interesting to see him with other painters and to see how he interacts with the whole art world in general. And Boston was starting to have an art world because it didn't before. I mean, it had Copley and it had some other kinds of art activity, but this is the period when art was really just blossoming in Boston. So that's a great, I wish I had a more interesting anecdote to tell you.
Was annoyed because he was just trying to get his work done. And from time to time, he found Sargent was a little bit of an irritant. And Sargent reportedly asked him, how do you paint a hand?
Hmm.
Response from Tarbell was, well, if you can't paint them, you hide them.
That's a great line. Yeah. Yeah. And the whole painting of hands, especially for portraits, is a whole history in itself. That's a great anecdote. Thank you. There's another hand.
Sargent actually painted a Wellesley resident.
Hmm.
Jane Honeywell.
Mhm.
The wife of Arthur Honeywell, who was one of the sons of Maine Honeywell, H.H. Honeywell, and lived on the estate, the Oaks, down Washington Street, was painted by Sargent. It's not a especially Sargent-like painting, it's more of a run-of-the-mill portrait. But interestingly, her maiden name was Boyd.
Ah,
And her brother was Edward Darley Boyd.
wow.
The father of the girls who are in the painting that is perhaps the most loved and well known as Sargent's painting at the MFA. And there's a Wellesley connection there because the daughter who is leaning up against the Chinese baize and not looking at Sargent, because apparently she was annoyed with him. Reason she was 14 and she was not happy in the portrait painting. But she went to spend the summer at the Oaks at the invitation of her aunt and uncle. And she had previously been in Pau in France, where her father was painting. And her father, Edward Darley Boyd, was apparently a very good friend of Sargent, and himself a painter. And she had learned to play golf in Pau. And when she came and stayed at the estate, she asked her uncle if there was any place to play golf. And he, somewhat is thought to have said, "What is golf?" And she proceeded to show him because she brought her clubs. And he ended up building a golf course around his estate. Oh my God. Which was the first golf course in Massachusetts by duration. So there's actually a rather interesting close Wellesley connection to Sargent.
Where does that Honeywell portrait exist? Where is it located?
You know, interesting, I tried to find it last night. And the National Portrait Gallery lists it, but it is not in their collection. And apparently is still owned by
Many private collections have Sargents. Yeah. I mean, that's a great series of stories. Thank you so much. I love the Wellesley connection, and especially to the Boyds. And, you know, Boston was a really small world, and Sargent's world was a really small world. Often when you put those things together, you get very dynamic, interesting sort of pieces fitting together. Yeah.
I'll assume that most of this work was done in watercolor. Is there any reason to believe that later in his life that he may have done some measurable or the amount of photography, portrait photography at all?
That's an interesting question because Sargent's career coincides with the invention and creation of photography. I mean, starting in 1839, which is the beginning of photography, but you know, his portraits were in competition with photography. Some painters of the time, like Thomas Eakins, used photography very actively as a way of creating both portraits and other kinds of paintings. Sargent had as little as possible to do with photography. There are photographs of him. His assistant, Nicolas d'Inverno, was often carrying some photographic equipment that shows us Sargent in the Alps or some other kinds of places. But Sargent self-consciously avoided photography, and felt he was in competition with photography. But it was, you know, one of the things that's interesting to sort of think about is what's different about photographic portraiture versus Sargent's version. But Sargent himself hated to be photographed. We have quite a few photographs of him, and some of them are quite eloquent, like the one that's on the cover there. And one of the things that I liked about that photograph too, it's in the Gothic room at the Gardner Museum, is that Sargent is, you see Sargent sitters and you see Sargent, and then on the other side you see his painting. So you see the process going on, and it's a very dynamic process. It's a great comment. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you so much. You were absolutely terrific. I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and Paul was fabulous. And we want to wish you all a safe trip home. And just to remind you, our next speaker will be March 21st, the Russia-Ukrainian War, a return to history. So look out for that in your emails, and hopefully you'll attend. Thank you again.
Thank you. I would be very happy to sign it. Thank you. Well, and so who am I?